The state of Florida is now among the worst states to live. With legalization on the ballot for November and with new gun laws that are turning Florida into Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, Florida is politically polarized and every single day becoming more and more extreme, where new laws coming into the books have more to do with catering to people's political ideologies than with safety or making the state a better place. It seems like things in Florida are going from bad to worse. Florida isn't quite yet the worst at any particular thing, but it's no longer the best at anything, and it's inching ever closer to the states that are considered the worst. Now, things in Florida aren't going to get as bad as Louisiana, Alabama, or Mississippi, but Florida is no longer among the best states to live. Florida continues to inch ever closer towards the bottom of the list in different categories, and while some of these analytics are happening as we speak, which means that for about a year or two, you're not going to start to see this on paper. Anybody living in Florida right now knows that things here continue to dive for the worse. So in today's video, we're going to talk about what these things that are happening in Florida are and why Florida continues to go from bad to worse. Homicide rates. It's not a surprise that the new gun laws that the state of Florida implemented are going to lead to higher homicide rates. Unfortunately, it seems like it's actually a massive aggravation more than just a small increase. Cities like Sarasota had 0 homicides last year, are already at 4 homicides this year. The city of Bradenton, for example, where I currently live, we've lost track, but I can see between 10 to 15 homicides around the vicinity of city limits. That's at least a 60% increase from the previous year. How did Florida's new gun laws make the state more dangerous? It's simple to see. Before, Florida had one of the best gun laws in the South. So we know the South has horrible crime rates, but the state of Florida was free from the gun violence that plagued the South because Florida had better gun laws. One of the key details about what made Florida safer is that if you wanted to carry, you had to have a simple class. The governor of Florida's new gun law got rid of that requirement, and ever since, everybody's been packing heat, and this has led to people who have very little gun safety knowledge to be walking around armed. These individuals under the previous laws would have not been armed. And what this has led to is if there are more idiots armed on the streets, it compels everybody else to be armed, including minors. We're starting to see an uptick in people under the age of 18 being caught with guns and being behind many of the homicides in the state of Florida. It's not a surprise that the reason these young people are choosing to arm themselves is because they feel that other people in the community are armed, and thus they feel the pressure to be armed themselves. A huge percentage of the homicides that are happening now in Florida is coming from teenage delinquency, and the state's new gun laws are vastly contributing to the agitation of this problem. When it comes to homicide rates, the state of Florida has always been somewhere in the middle. The same thing can be said about California. They're states that somewhat mimic the national averages. However, recently the state of California has seen an 18% decrease in their homicide rates. Likely Florida will see the same amount of change, but in the negative direction. Talking about California, the state of Florida is now more expensive to live than California, but the wages in Florida are on par with states like Alabama. Renting in a large city like Miami, Tampa, or Orlando is now starting to cost roughly equivalent to what it would cost to rent in Los Angeles or San Diego or even New York City. With one exception, the incomes in those cities are more than double the incomes of Florida cities. You're having the price of living in some of the most expensive cities, but you're having incomes that are on par with some of the poorest regions in the country. Sure, California and New York are very expensive states to live with a lot of taxes and cost of living is expensive, but the incomes make up for it. Now, cost of living in Florida, in particular insurance in Florida, is among the most expensive in the country, but the incomes are stagnant. A recent study shows that 30% of Florida's labor force is earning less than $17 an hour. That is less than, for example, the state of Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, on par with states like Kentucky. The worst state ended up being Mississippi at 41%. The state of Washington ranking number 1, where only 12% of its workers are making less than $17 an hour. California, 15% of the workers make less than $17 an hour. That means that there are 2 times more people in Florida getting paid minimal, crappy wages than there are in California, except for the cost of living in these states these days is roughly about the same. The drug overdose death rate in Florida is now nearly twice as high as Texas and significantly higher than California. Nationally, when it comes to drug overdoses, Florida ranks around number 21. And that's not exactly horrendous until you start to realize that the state of Florida is one of the top 3 larger states in the country, and that the states that usually dominate this list are states like West Virginia, Maine, with small populations and somewhat more isolated. For one of the largest states in the country to have a drug overdose rate this bad, things are really not moving in the right direction in Florida. After all, this isn't a problem that plagues large populous areas. It's a problem that usually affects rural, impoverished, and isolated regions. Among the 4 larger states, Florida, Texas, California, and New York, Florida has the worst drug overdose problem. How else are people dying in Florida? It's not just homicides and overdoses. Cities in Florida are starting to have among the highest pedestrian accident rates in the entire country, with cities like Bradenton, Pompano Beach, Fort Lauderdale dominating these lists of the worst places for pedestrians. Sarasota isn't far behind. Why does the state of Florida dominate these lists of cities with the most pedestrian fatalities? It's quite simple. A combination of people engaging in DUI, pedestrians engaging in DUI. We're talking about people riding bicycles while intoxicated, as well as people who are walking under the influence, limited infrastructure like sidewalks and crosswalks, badly lit roads in urban areas that have a lot of pedestrian traffic. The proportion of people that are really underpaid employees contributes to many people not having access to automobiles. A combination of people under the influence, bad infrastructure, and low incomes has led to Florida having an explosion of pedestrian accidents. Homelessness. The state of Florida claims to only have 30,000 people homeless. This number is made up of individual counties. We've done extensive research on how accurate these numbers are for particular counties, and we have discovered that these numbers are inaccurate. Florida now has the 2nd highest homeless population in the United States, by far surpassing states like New York and Texas. Only California has a larger homeless population. Despite the fact that the state of Florida is trying to manipulate analytics and distort the reality of the homeless problem, it is clear as somebody who has traveled the United States that Florida has the 2nd largest homeless population in the country. Many of Florida's homeless are dealing with addiction. I know the official numbers, but the addiction rate among homeless somewhere around 67%. From my personal experiences dealing with the homeless in the areas that I have here in Florida, about 95% of the people that are homeless are addicted. However, many of Florida's homeless population are dying off from the inhumane conditions, pestilences, and many of the ailments that are affecting the homeless people due to the harsh living conditions that they face. Florida's homeless population is dying off at an alarming rate, and many of the reasons that these people are dying are being blamed on medical conditions. However, the contributing factor and the reason why these people are dying are linked to 2 major causes. One being addiction. This addiction doesn't always lead to overdose deaths. Sometimes it leads to many of those accidents, those pedestrian fatalities that we have been talking about. And the number of pedestrian fatalities merges with regular pedestrian fatalities, and it's difficult to determine what percentage of those people were actually homeless that were addicted. But one of the leading causes of the homeless in the state of Florida right now is in fact accidents. They're being hit by vehicles. Perhaps one of the most alarming things about this analytic is that it's an analytic that merges with other analytics, and it's difficult to tell how many of those homeless people that are dying in Florida are dying because of the fact that they were intoxicated or under the influence, and were hit by a vehicle during their own intoxication versus regular pedestrian accidents which happen for other reasons. The second thing that is killing off the Florida population of homeless at an alarming rate is medical ailments. We're seeing people that have simple infections or things that could easily be cured. In other states, the homeless have better access to health care. They're living in areas where there is much more compassion for the homeless, and individuals who are homeless and encounter some type of medical complication are able to obtain medical care. While in the state of Florida, many homeless people eventually end up having amputations or medical complications that are aggravated by their condition of homelessness that many times lead to death. These are deaths that go completely uncounted by the usual metrics. When we look at homeless population, addiction, homicides, many times these analytics don't accurately depict the real percentage of the homeless population that is dying off. It's really impossible to calculate the mortality rate among homeless people in the state of Florida, but at some of the homeless camps that I've been to, I've tried to do somewhat of a census of how many people were here a year ago and how many are now. It seems like on an annual basis, about 1 in 20 homeless people are dying. And I've been to places where that rate is actually as low as 1 in 12. In more safe areas and rural areas, it's about 1 in 40 annual. The mortality rate among Florida's homeless population is astonishing. It's scary. If you become homeless in Florida, your chances of living, moving forward, diminish incredibly. So far, I really haven't found any metric to calculate exactly how disproportionately homeless people are dying in the state of Florida, but I can guarantee you, compared to other states that have a similar problem, I don't think any other state situation for homeless people is as delicate as it is in the state of Florida. And the main reason is that the state of Florida is outright inhumane with how they view the homeless population, denying them access to medical care, denying them access to stores, denying them access to due process when dealing with law enforcement. The moment that you become homeless in Florida, you literally have less rights than somebody here illegally. It's this outright marginalization of the homeless population in Florida that is contributing to the homeless population here being more vulnerable than anywhere else. And the homeless population isn't just people who are addicted. For many of these people, addiction doesn't start until after they become homeless. It means that they weren't addicted before they were homeless. Why is this a problem among Florida's homeless population? Because a considerable percentage of Florida's population on the streets were originally people that were living a normal life and encountered an injury, a painful injury like an accident that eventually led to them being on prescription medication. And thus these were individuals that ended up on the streets because of a recent injury, and while they were on the streets, they started to take medication for their pain from the injury. This is a considerable percentage of the homeless population and varies vastly from city to city, but in some areas I've been to in Florida, about 1/3 of the homeless population is homeless because of a considerably large accident that led them to homelessness. Even more scary is the notion that many of these individuals were injured by another party and they were denied benefits, a settlement, or some type of benefit coverage for their injury that in most states and circumstances they would have had. That is because in the state of Florida, insurance companies are literally trampling over the people. Take a new law that's coming into the state of Florida that will make it more difficult for people who are injured to be able to receive compensation. I'm not going to dive into details about this situation, but a huge part of the problem leading to homelessness in Florida is that many times when people are injured, they're not able to receive just compensation for their injury because the new evolving state laws are leaving people vulnerable to protect the interests of large corporations. And again, I'm not going to dive too much into details, but this is another contributing factor to why so many people are newly entering homelessness in Florida. It's this merciless attitude and complete marginalization of the state's poor population that has now made a huge number of people living in Florida economically marginalized and socially outcast, making their potential of making a livelihood literally impossible. The state of Florida continues to marginalize people among its population that it considers undesirable, and economically this is putting a huge strain on the state of Florida. In the past, the United States has economically marginalized people like within the African American community, but recently these changes are starting to target people who own older homes, people who are disabled, people who are homeless, people that do not fit into the ideal concept of what the state of Florida is catering to. If you don't fit that mold, you become economically undesirable and socially and economically marginalized in the state of Florida. The new changes in the realm of insuring properties in the state of Florida, as well as financing homes, means that individuals who have older properties, these properties are becoming undesirable to insurance companies, difficult to insure. The only viable option that people have moving to the state of Florida is to buy a new home. Any neighborhood that is plagued with an older population of homes, simply a neighborhood where insurance rates are going to be higher. Financing becomes more difficult as these insurance companies are refusing to touch anything that's older, not up to the current codes. The state of Florida continues to cater and facilitate the construction of new homes and new communities while ostracizing older neighborhoods. A prime example is new changes in zoning. It seems like the state of Florida continues to make agricultural land usable for commercial use and for residential development. However, all these changes are taking place in the hands only of developers. No agricultural land is being shifted into single plot residential properties where a normal person can buy a piece of land that has been rezoned. All of the land rezoning is taking place only for the use and benefit of large commercial developments. These developments are usually gated communities which have HOAs, and thus housing in the state of Florida moving forward becomes more unobtainable to the low-income earner, since all of the new home construction is taking place in areas that are only catering to these HOA-type communities. This in turn creates a crunch in affordable housing, since the options that people who cannot afford to live in gated communities are increasingly more difficult to find. There is no creation of affordable housing. Many cities, counties, and municipalities in the state of Florida keep shutting down affordable housing, while all of the rezoning that's taking place right now is only to benefit large developments which are only building large communities with HOAs. Properties that are inaccessible to somebody in a state that now has some of the worst incomes in the entire country. This economical marginalization from a zoning perspective, from a city planning perspective, is leaving housing unaffordable, inaccessible, and no new options entering the market for affordable housing in the state of Florida. The only place that the poor working class people are able to buy a home today in Florida are places like Lehigh Acres, Northport, Spring Hill, and other areas that are grid patterns that are unincorporated. These areas do not have access to city sewage or even water. These areas are on septic tanks and on well water, and many of these areas do not even have access to internet. So while the upfront cost of these properties is less, when you actually look at the long-term possibilities of somebody who buys a house in one of these areas that are far away outskirts of suburbs, areas that are unincorporated with no access to utilities, in the long term, the people that buy these houses, the upkeep cost and the general cost of living for those individuals, when you calculate things like commutes, the general livability of these areas is challenged. Access to utilities is limited. The maintenance of these systems of water treatment, as well as septic tanks, lack of infrastructure, lack of access to utilities, in the long term means that the people that are buying these houses in these areas are disadvantaged economically, and somebody buying a gated community or a home in an HOA will in the long term have a lower cost of ownership because they're usually more centrally located, have better access to infrastructure and utilities. What this means that not only are the poor people in Florida not having any options, but the options that they have in the long term cost more than what the rich people are getting. And that's going to lead to the fact that life in Florida will continue to get even more difficult for those who don't have. The state of Florida continues to become a less and less attractive state to live, with a growing homeless population, crime and homicides increasing due to the new state laws, as well as an addiction rate that is unacceptable for a state so massive. The problems in Florida continue to mount, but the icing on the cake is the cost of living on top of the low wages that the states have, making life for the poor people here literally impossible. And let's be clear, the poor people are actually some of the hardest working people in the United States. They work long hours, they work difficult jobs. It's the wages that they're getting that's the problem. It's not that the people in Florida don't want to work. It's that they have to work like animals, and every single day they're making less while everything costs more. And while that's probably happening throughout the entire country, Florida is the king of inflation, and it's starting to be as well as one of the worst states for wages. If you got rid of the 1% of earners in the state of Florida, those people that come here for tax purposes, the 99% in Florida is among the poorest in the United States, but their cost of living is as far as some of the most expensive cities to live in the country. Clearly, the math doesn't add up in Florida. Finally, legalization is coming to Florida. It's on the ballot for November, but we know that in Florida, people are going to vote for it. With that comes the notion that Florida could become like Oklahoma. Now, we've seen what it's done to states like Michigan and Oklahoma. I'll make another video that elaborates more on the topic of legalization and how it's going to affect the state of Florida. But we know for a fact, based off our travels to states like Oklahoma, how the vast majority of people feel about this. You're going to walk into a hotel and that's the only thing you're going to smell. You're going to be at a park and that's the only thing you're going to smell. It really is distasteful, and it's going to make life in Florida feel that much crappier. Again, going back to Oklahoma, I talked to the people in that state about how they felt, about how it's affected their state, and I couldn't find a single person that said it made their state a better place. Even people who told me they were users told me that they can see how it was a horrible decision to make.
I'm kind of far right politically, so I don't want to sound like a hypocrite.
And that's going to be coming to Florida soon, because we know how the people of Florida are going to vote on that topic. So it looks like the state of Florida continues to change for the worse, and it's starting to pick up the worst of the worst changes a state can make, with some of the worst of liberal policies like legalization and the worst of conservative policies like relaxing gun laws, even though it will lead to higher homicide rates. It seems like Florida is really plagued with the worst of both worlds, and you're going to have a very polarizing state with policies that cater to people's sentiments but don't cater to a better society. There was a time when lawmaking catered to making a safer, better society, but today lawmaking in states like Florida that are becoming ever more polarizing no longer cater towards making a state safer or better. Lawmaking today has nothing to do with what is better for the people and better for a state, more to do with catering to the ever-changing desires of polarizing political views. Now, I can't just get up and leave Florida because it's going to crap. I have a business on YouTube, more yet a career off of YouTube, and Florida is our audience and where we create our content, as well as the fact that most of my family and people I love and places that I grew up around are all in Florida. I've lived in Florida now for over 25 years. This is home. I just don't like the way the state is changing, and I wouldn't recommend people to move to Florida unless they're aware of how Florida really is becoming economically for people that don't have a large net worth. I've always said that to live in Florida, you need a large net worth. If you have a lot of money, it is a great place to live. But even if you have money in Florida, uncomfortable changes are coming to the states. Homelessness continues to increase. In Naples, Florida, where I grew up, homelessness was just about unheard of. Right up on about the year 2015, things really started to get bad, and they haven't stopped since. Gun laws in Florida are going to increasingly make the state a more dangerous place. And this is a law that many people that are against the law actually supported because they're afraid of being labeled a liberal. Go figure. I actually have friends who are very prolific gun owners. They are really into guns. They have hundreds of guns, and I got a few friends that are just absolute gun nuts. They just love guns. And I ask every single last one of them, do you really think that this is a good idea. And they all told me, we know it's a bad idea, but we're afraid to speak out because if we speak out, we're going to be labeled as liberals. So again, in the state of Florida now, it's not what makes sense, what's going to make our state better. It's, well, I'm afraid of being labeled a liberal, so I'm going to support this gun law, even though it's going to make the state a much more dangerous place. Even people who like guns and are gun owners and gun collectors would agree for the most part that you should at least have that safety course. And we've seen already in just a very short time the increase of lives that are being lost in Florida since this change took place. Yeah, this isn't somebody's opinion. This is the reality that since this gun law took place, Florida has become increasingly more dangerous. We're seeing shootouts. I mean, there's been shootouts in Miami, in Tampa, Orlando, Jacksonville. I mean, it has just been an explosion of violence in Florida since they changed these laws. And they're probably too proud to say, we made a mistake, this was a bad idea. But the analytics are there, and I'm sure people who work in law enforcement would know even better than me how the state of Florida has changed. There's nothing wrong with the gun laws here previously. Many times people in law enforcement like that other people are armed because the more people are armed, the less they have to risk their lives. And people in law enforcement, if you're going to do their job for them, well, that's not my job to be a cop. I'm not a cop, you know? And what I learned while living in Alabama is that many times these states that are super pro-gun laws are actually states where law enforcement is absolutely unwilling to risk their life for you. I pay a lot of taxes. I should be able to dial 911 and have a cop outside, and if somebody needs to get shot, the cop needs to handle that for me. And that's the way it is in a lot of states. It's the way it used to be in Florida. But now, if you're expected to be armed, then now you're paying taxes for what? If the cops aren't going to be armed, if I'm the one that's got to be armed and I got to go out and make these decisions myself, and well, then why am I paying so many taxes for? That's the cop's job. That's not my job. What a lot of people don't understand is that the moment you start to arm citizens, that's the moment that law enforcement no longer has to respond to dangerous situations. They step back and put the responsibility on you as the individual, a responsibility that I didn't sign up for. You probably have no idea what I'm talking about. Move to Alabama, move to Louisiana, you'll find out. When a state's gun laws become very relaxed, that responsibility no longer falls on the hands of law enforcement. It falls on you as the individual, and it omits law enforcement's responsibility in having to react to crime, which is the reason states like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama are absolutely out of control with gun violence, because it's up to the civilians to make that determination, because law enforcement is unwilling to do anything when there's a crime, because again, they put that responsibility on who? You, the civilian. It simply doesn't work. It hasn't worked very well in the Deep South. Lots of gun lovers there. Lots of states like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama with very relaxed gun laws. How has it worked for them? Not very freaking well. But even Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana don't have the problem that Florida has. The fact that everybody here is drunk or high out of their freaking minds. Now you're combining really liberal policies on addiction, really liberal policies on recreational use with very conservative gun laws. What do you think happens when everybody's high, drunk, and armed? A freaking massacre. And it doesn't take a genius to figure that out. This is a direction that Florida is heading into. Overall, I can tell you that state of Florida is becoming one of the worst places to live. I hope that culturally, the people in Florida are not as indoctrinated in crime and lawlessness as people in the Deep South. But with a lot of addiction, a lot of drugs, the legalization of those things coming to the state of Florida with relaxed gun laws, if people are high, drunk, and they're armed, you can expect the state to be a very dangerous and unpredictable place. So while you may not deal with the overall volume of crime as you have in those states, there's going to be times when things in Florida are going to get rough for the locals. And again, if it wasn't for the fact this is where my audience is from and this is where my family and loved ones live, I would have left this state a very long time ago. In fact, I did leave the state, but I left it for the wrong state. I left it for a state that has kind of become what Florida wants to be, which is depressing because I've lived in Alabama and I've seen how that state's laws make that state a crappy place. And it's like, why would you want to be like Alabama? Why would you want to be like Louisiana? These are states that are failing in every category possible. Why would you mirror your laws by states that are failing? Who looks at something that is failing, points a finger and says, hey, I want to be like that piece of crap over there? It's really astonishing that the state of Florida, a state that was so different than the South, is now legislatively starting to look at these other states, and the results are starting to be clear. Violence left and right, homicides left and right. And then on top of that, on the other end, they're also catering to the things that attract homelessness. So it's like a double, what was that guy on TV called? The Billy guy that used to sell stuff where if you buy one, you get another one or something. That's what Florida's becoming. You're getting in Alabama, like here, you can buy in Alabama and get a free California. I don't want Florida to be Alabama. I don't want Florida to be California. I think Florida's great just the way it is. But man, are they dragging this state through the toilet right now. Unfortunately, people keep thinking that they can move to Florida affordably, and this has become a business model to rip you off and take every dollar you have. I've made videos talking about these mobile home parks where you buy the mobile home but you don't own the land. Now we're starting to see insurance costs and HOA fees. People's HOA fees used to be $150 a month. Now they're $900 a month. But I was warning you guys, there's a reason why a lot of these properties in Florida are just bad things to buy. No other state has devoted so much landscape to mobile home parks, condominiums, HOAs, and other types of properties that are complete money pits. You never really get to own these properties. You never really get to be in charge. You're always at the mercy of HOAs, associations, insurance companies, and changing and revolving state laws. These are properties that are designated money pits, and the turnover on these properties is incredibly high since most of the people that are buying these properties are only buying them to retire. A lot of people buy these properties and don't even live them as second homes. It simply doesn't function. You live in an urban area that's population density nightmare, very urbanized centers, yet parts of the year it's a complete ghost town because half the people are not here. This type of society that Florida has become simply doesn't function. And all the while many years ago when things were affordable, we could deal with it. But now in the summertime when rents are $2,000 a month and there's literally nowhere to extract that kind of money, the locals end up in unrepairable economic situations, dire conditions. This is the reality of the regular working class person living in Florida. And it's gotten so bad that even the middle class is starting to feel the pinch. And that is the state of Florida in 2024. Quickly on track to become one of the worst states to live, despite the state having a diverse amount of people. It's not the beaches and the weather and the vibes that we don't like. It's the way the state of Florida is set up, the lack of industry, and of course, so many people milking the regular working class person, a state that has become economically rigged to keep us down. A state where the situation for the poor white person has become as dire and discriminating and oppressive as it has been for blacks and Hispanics for decades. Now, if you're a poor white person living in Florida, you are just as discriminated and economically deprived as a black or a Latino. Welcome to the club, poor white people, and pretty soon, welcome to the class, middle class. We're all going to be in this room together looking at each other, wondering what the crap happened. After all, the state of Florida is designed for that 1%. It's a state that continues to cater just to that elite top layer of people. A top layer of people that care little to none about me and you in the 99%. And once again, Florida is a great place to live if you have large sums of money. But even large sums of money don't seem to last very long with how expensive Florida is getting and how difficult it's become to find a stream of income. Do you believe things are getting worse in Florida, or do you think these changes are great? Let me know what you think in the comment section. Personally,